first DLS of full fall. Excited to be able to introduce our speaker today. John told me there's no announcements, so come next week for the next one. But today we have Putman, who has not traveled too far, just come up from down in the
Liberty Wells.
And he's one of our distinguished alumnus. Here as a PhD student in the spatial group for several years. And before that, got a master's at Dartmouth. On there, who's one of the big thinkers in isotopes in the atmosphere in particular. So she came here with isotopes on the mind and worked largely on isotopes with us. Before that, she got her bachelor's degree at Michigan Tech University. One of, pretty sure, statistically significantly non-random number of people that have come through our group spent time in Houghton, Michigan.
Yeah, for such a small town, it's really
3 or 4.
Surprising how many have funneled through.
And she worked on atmospheric chemistry. Also, she graduated here in
2019
and had been a part of the program that basically allows grad students to get experience with the USGS. Where she's a hydrologist. I understand she gets to do a lot of her own research still, which is fun, but also gets to manage projects and coordinate others. I've been excited to see all the cool things she's done since she went there. Still doing some isotope work.
A little bit.
Yes. But also has branched out substantially in customer quality to water models that the USGS uses, and other things that she will talk about. So we've been fortunate to get to continue to interact through the spatial course, socially, but excited about formal sense. Her research life.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabe. Really appreciate it. And yeah, really appreciate you guys all being here. I was reflecting that the last time that I was standing here specifically to give a talk, I was defending my PhD like 5 years ago. So it's really fun to be back. I've been now out about as long as I was in, so, and here in Salt Lake for 10 years. So really kind of a fun like nostalgia trip there. So as Gabe was talking about, we do a lot of different things with the survey. And so I was trying to think of like a good title to put on this because it's sort of all over the place. And what it came down to for me was like these thematic areas. So like human effects, drought effects on hydrologic systems, and also their downstream effects, which in the Western US, which means that we're going to talk scientifically about dust and using water isotopes to benchmark a hydrologic model. But before we get to that, I was also thinking about, you know, being a student here and the fact that most of the speakers that came through were speakers from academia. And so I hadn't had the chance maybe to learn that much about other career paths. And so I want to take just a short period of time to talk about what it's like to work at the survey. So for all of the professors here, apologies, you can look at your phone or whatever. This is for the students. The US Geological Survey, where I work, is a federal agency, and it's the fact-finding arm of the Department of Interior. And we have 5 mission areas. We've got natural hazards, so that's like volcanoes and earthquakes. We've got water resources, so that's like our stream gauging. We've also got energy and minerals, so that's like both remediation and finding where minerals are. We've also got ecosystems and environment, which is a lot about like things like PFAS or like contaminants in the environment and like biological systems. And then we've got our core science missions, which those folks produce a lot of our like products like NHD Plus that we use for like mapping or like the watershed boundary data set. And we as an agency, we work with more than 2,000, or we as the survey work with more than 2,000 different agencies that may include state or local or tribal governments, as well as others. And so I specifically work at the Utah Water Science Center. The Utah Water Science Center is located in West Valley, not very far from here. And a water science center fits into the greater USGS picture in the sense that it's a place where we have both sort of our data side of things, where people are going out and our hydrotechs are getting stream gauge measurements, they're getting water quality measurements. These are the things like if you're going on a rafting trip and you want to know what the water level is, you know, like what you're going to be dealing with, you might go to a gauge site and you might be like, okay, it's running really high. That's the data that we supply. So it's useful for recreationalists, but it's also useful for our different partners who may have questions about like how much water is coming in, or, you know, what to expect in the future, what's the water quality, things like that. So our data section is really important to the USGS on the whole, and every state has a water science center. Some of them share among a few states, but every state is covered by a water science center. Our water science center also has GIS services, so watershed boundary database production type of stuff. We also have our investigation side, which is more like your research side of things. You might be asking questions about, you know, water quantity, water quality in the future. It's much more like the research you might do as a postdoc or a professor or something like that, but a little bit more applied, I would say. And then finally, the backbone of everything, we have our admin and IT folks. Make sure to give them a call out because they're important. And then if you're at all thinking about careers within the survey, there are a few different types of positions that you can get hired on for. So we have 180-day field assistants, which I know some of you in the room, I'm looking at you, are in the process of doing or have done. And so this is something where we might hire for a short period of time to support lab work or field work. It's a really, really great way if you're thinking about the survey as a career to get in the door and kind of have an understanding of like, is this something I like to do? Could I see myself here? Because it's not binding, you know, you're doing it over the summer maybe, or, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be full-time, it could be part-time. So you're getting paid to do science, have a new experience, but, you know, it might not have to be a full-time job. And then another way that we hire on is through student pathways positions. And this is how I came on. You can be hired either as a student or within 2 years of graduating. And this is a really great way if you've decided this is really what I want to do. This is our easiest way to hire people and bring them into the survey, is to get in the door as a student. So you could work part or full-time for 1 or a couple of years. And then when you graduate, you have your, you know, paper in hand that certifies that you've done everything you need to do. You will get non-competitively converted, if you would like to be, to full-time as a term position. And so that would mean that you're, you know, kind of in a probationary period, but then once you kind of get out of that, you could be non-competitively converted to a perm position, which is great because then you have a permanent job, you know, and it's like, you can't lose it. You have to be real bad to lose a permanent position. So I would say this is like the best way to get in. But when you're, you know, if you're thinking about applying to something like this, you really need to check out what the position description is and whether you have the classes that support like the requirements for that position description. I would also recommend looking at the GS level that they're advertising for and see if that's a pay grade that you're interested in, because they can't switch it. You can't really negotiate it. If they're advertising for a 5.7, you can't ask for a 9. So just, you know, being really clear on that, and then looking at the full performance level. So like if you were to stay for a career, would you be happy with that as a full performance level, grade level? We also run term positions and perm positions, but much less often. And so they're a little bit less useful to maybe kind of look for. Your kind of best ways are your field assistants and your pathways positions. Okay. So some of the perks of working for the survey, I asked 15 of my closest friends, like, how would you describe the survey? And you can see overall people are talking about it's collaborative, you get to work in teams, it's interdisciplinary, and people are overall really, really friendly. You've got this network, huge network across the nation of people with all different expertises that if you have a question, you know, you just find the person who maybe knows about it, you write to them, and you almost always get a positive response. Like, I've never reached out to somebody and had them be like, don't talk to me, you know? And so just having this like friendly and collaborative, like large network, I think is a really great way to have the experience of, you know, doing science and getting into, you know, different areas that you might be interested in. But of course, there are downsides as well. And one of them that I've observed from folks coming out of academia is that it can be a little bit less clear, like what success looks like. So when you're coming out of academia, you might be like, okay, I'll get a postdoc, and then I'll get an assistant professorship, and then I'll get tenure. And like, you know, and I'll kind of get to stay in my area of study, but maybe branch out a little bit. When you show up to the survey, you might end up here in the middle, which is like the best place to be, what's needed, what you're good at, and what you like. But a lot of times we end up in these like what you like and what is needed, but you're not necessarily good at it yet. So you're a little stressed out. Or it's what's needed and what you're good at, but you're not that into it. So you're like, fine, I'll do it, but maybe I'm not stoked. You almost never get to do something that you like and that you're good at, but it's not needed. Like you'll never get anything funded over here. So don't expect that. And that's, I mean, I think that's true for academia as well, but the sweet spot is really that place in the middle, but you end up kind of over on this little side over here most of the time. And that can be hard if you come in and you're like, I had this training, I'm really good at this thing, and then nobody will fund you for it. It can be a little bit hard to be like, what's my identity now? Like, you know, I don't feel that good at these other things. So that can be challenging. But I mean, the upside is you get to do a lot of different interesting things. So as like a snapshot, just for me as a scientist, these are the different things that I work on at the survey right now. So we've got our whole snow hydrology part of it. We've got our salinity and water part of it, which is like largely with our Bureau of Reclamation partners. We've got our dust sciences part of it, which is both here, and then also we have a project near Pinyon Plain Mine, which is south of Grand Canyon Rim. And then finally, there's like the hydrologic modeling part of it. And all of these different projects in different ways are related to these different topical areas like water quality, human modification of natural systems, climate change, drought. There's other ones in there as well. So they're all related under this big umbrella. And you can start to see some pretty neat relationships between them. But at the outset, it can feel a little bit like, okay, I just do this thing and then I do this other thing. And who am I as a scientist? I don't even know. But it is really fun to have that flexibility and just kind of the different opportunities. So the things that I'll talk about today scientifically are a couple projects out of our dust science kind of side of things. So the evaluation of health effects of metals and dust in the Great Salt Lake region and how that's related to Great Salt Lake playa. And then I'll also talk about one of our hydrologic modeling projects, which is the isotope-enabled evaluation of the National Water Model. Ooh, okay, lots of talking, a little bit of water. So we're starting with the dust project. And so what we're looking at here is spatially variable contributions of Great Salt Lake playa and industrial sourced priority pollutants that are delivered to communities in northern Utah. And so I did this work with my colleagues, Molly Blakowski, who I know some of you guys know, Destry DeVesti, Diego Fernandez, who y'all know well, Morgan McDonald, Patrick Longley, and Dan Jones. And I just want to point out the analyses I'm showing here are preliminary. They're not for citation or distribution. I'm saying that because the government told me I need to say that. So please don't cite it, please don't distribute it. If you want to see some of like the preliminary work associated with this, we did put out a report for the Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. That's who funded this work. And then we did, if you want to look at the data, we have a data release here. So the study area is basically this whole area from like north of Salt Lake City all the way up to Logan to the east, more or less, of Great Salt Lake. And so let's see. The reason why we're interested in this is, although we know that Utah has dealt with episodic dust for a long time, this is the number of dust events per year. anywhere from like 0 to 15, we're starting to be more and more concerned about Great Salt Lake. So we know, dust comes from many sources. Greg Carling did some really nice work, has been continuing to do really nice work using strontium isotope data, and he's able to show with that a lot of the dust sort of along the Wasatch Front is actually looks a lot like severe dry lake, severe desert, but also some of these other areas are potential regional dust sources. And they're maybe a lot bigger. So we're like, okay, they're bigger, maybe they're a bigger deal. Why are we so worried about Great Salt Lake now? And I think I don't have to say this super loud because you guys all know, I mean, Great Salt Lake is at some of its lowest levels that it has been over the course of our recording history. So these are lake level data from USGS, from the Saltair gauge, and this is from the Great Salt Lake Strike Team 2023 report. And we're over here in this serious adverse effects zone. And so we hear about it in the news, we hear about it on the media, and we're worried about it, we're talking about it. And so, and we're talking about it because this area is closer to people than all of these other areas. But then even on top of that, this area, particularly Farmington Bay and even into Bear River Bay, so Farmington Bay over here and Bear River Bay over here, have a lot of metals and pollutants in them. This is a terminal lake, so anything that happens in this basin, if it gets in the water, it ends up in the lake and it stays there, more or less. So this is why we're concerned, and this is our area of study. So what we did is we put out passive samplers for collecting dust. So this is what that looks like. This is like a bunt pan, just like a cake pan. We actually pioneered the double bunt system. So you've got a metal pan on the outside, you've got you've got the silicone pan on the inside so that you're not contaminating metals from the the metal pan into your dust samples. We've got a bunch of marbles in there and they're suspended on plastic mesh. And then we've also got bird spikes because birds absolutely love to come sit on these things and poop in there and drop their bugs in there and everything. And so we put these on there to kind of keep them off. Although there was one very wily owl apparently that came, I believe they were probably sitting here in the middle, and they ended up coughing up an owl pellet and it got stuck in our bird spikes. So that was a really fun thing to come back and find, but yeah, the birds love it out there. So yes, so the reason why we did this as opposed to maybe an active sampler or something like that is because these are really low cost and you can get a really nice spatial picture. So if you're curious about getting kind of a first pass look at maybe what's going on as far as dust systematics or contamination, this is a great way to go about it because it doesn't cost as much money and you get that spatial footprint so you can see where you might want to hone in on a little bit better. And so just for the remainder of this talk, I grouped our different sites into our southern sites. So these are orange, our central sites, which are pink, our northern sites, which are blue. They're a little bit harder to see. And then we've got Playa Proximal in yellow near Farmington Bay. And then other Playa Proximal are in gray, or not gray, tan. And they're sort of in other places near the playa. So that sort of key will be helpful to see later in even the next figure. So we collected this dust and we measured it for metals actually with Diego. And so this is kind of a first look at that data grouped by the different groupings that I pointed out. And it's displayed relative to the average upper continental crust. And the first thing that you can kind of pick out about this is dust tends to be enriched in most metals compared to upper continental crust. And that's not surprising really at all. But I think the thing that is really worth pointing out is I've highlighted here the elements that are EPA priority pollutants, and then other elements that have a reference dose. So this is a way that we can evaluate the health impacts of this. So anything that has highlighting behind it is potentially a health risk when it comes to consumption. And what I see here is we've got a variety over here that are maybe they're enriched relative to upper continental crust, but pointing out that these are order of magnitude enrichments. Some of our highest are things like lead, arsenic, selenium, copper, cadmium, and zinc. So stuff that when we think about health effects, we're like, ooh, you know, that makes me nervous. And so we kind of want to understand like what's going on, what are the sources of these, and do we need to be concerned? So how can we figure that out? So how do we figure out which areas in our study region are more affected by metals and dust? So we can ask a question, are there high concentrations of many different priority pollutants? Would you consider it a metals mixture? Is it really just like one thing that's driving, you know, the higher concentrations? Are there high fluxes of many different priority pollutants? You might think if there's higher fluxes, you'd have a higher likelihood of then interacting with that dust. And then finally, kind of the kicker, do the levels exceed some health benchmark? So the way that we get at this, I'll talk you through the ways that we get at this. So for the first question, we went at it two different ways. And so the first one here, the first panel is the sum of the enrichments of priority pollutants relative to upper continental crust. So that was like that first figure that I showed you. Basically, if you take anything that's a priority pollutant and you add it all together, you would see, you know, the biggest values in the places where you had either the most different priority pollutants that were high enrichment, or, you know, one particular one that was really high. So it has some positives and some drawbacks. And for that, we can see like our highest values are, well, our highest value is on Farmington Bay, which that's not a place where people live, but it's a nice like kind of benchmark for, you know, what we're seeing downwind of it. But then otherwise, sort of in our central to southern region, we see our darkest colors. Okay, so then if we want to take the sort of differences in enrichment values out of it, we can do a ranked sum approach. So this would be like for each element for all of the sites, like where does it rank? Is it the highest concentration? Is it the lowest concentration among all of its sites? Then you can add up the priority pollutants. And so you would see numbers closer to 1 if you have more priority pollutants that are higher concentration or higher ranked. Whereas 0 would be like, they really tend to be low relative to their partners. So this doesn't give us like a benchmark to outside information, but it does give us a benchmark within our system of what's going on. And so for here, we see kind of a similar pattern. This like central to southern area has darker colors, more priority pollutants, stronger mixture. So it's similar pattern in these two different ways of looking at it. Then when we want to get at flux, we can basically just calculate the, you know, the concentration times the flux, the total dust flux, and add that up for all priority pollutants. And for that, we see some of our highest priority pollutant fluxes kind of in our central area, so off of Farmington Bay and into Ogden. And then if we plot them next to one another, so this is this figure on the x-axis, this figure on the y-axis, you can see that we've got maybe a couple different pathways for getting to priority pollutant enrichment. And I'm going to make this figure bigger, just kind of show you where this is happening. So I also put strontium isotope ratios on here because they're a really nice tracer of Great Salt Lake. So purpler colors are more like Great Salt Lake B. The oranger colors are either, you know, sort of local sediments or severe dry lake type of isotope signal, just kind of as the shorthand. And so this sort of lower flux area is kind of, that's what's going on here, whereas our higher flux, more Great Salt Lake B is like what we see here. And so then we might want to know, like, how do they look? Did they look different in terms of the metals that are contributing? So I think the first figure over there, like the pie charts, really just shows you that they're overall pretty similar to one another. The low flux area is on, the southern low flux area is on the left. The central high flux area is on the right. So they look overall pretty similar, but if you take the percent difference, this kind of zone tends to be much higher in copper and then nickel, whereas our sort of higher flux, more Great Salt Lake-y looking area is higher in, what do we have here? Lead, arsenic, chromium, and cadmium. And especially arsenic is one that we know is really well tied to Great Salt Lake sediments. So this is kind of all tracking where it's like, okay, in some cases we're getting these metals mixtures because of industrial activity. Sometimes we're getting it from Great Salt Lake contributions, depends on where you are. But then, when we're talking about metals, we want to know what it means as far as human health. That's really important. So how do we assess that? There are three kind of main ways that we look at human health effects. We look at it for inhalation, we look at it for dermal exposure, we look at it for ingestion. And for dust, most of the time we're thinking about inhalation. Unfortunately, because of the way that we collected these samples, they're not really appropriate for assessments for inhalation because the dust deposited in a pan, it's not really representative of what concentrations people were experiencing out there. So in this case, we're better off assessing using ingestion pathway. And so you're thinking like, well, why would you go out and like eat dirt, right? Like, or dust. This is incidental ingestion. So think of like, you're going on a walk in the neighborhood and you pick an apple off a tree. We have a lot of fruit trees here. You don't wash it before you eat it. If there's dust on that apple, you're incidentally consuming dust. This is a lot bigger of a deal for small children because they spend a lot of time on the ground. So they're, crawling around, grab something from the ground, they put it in their mouth. This is incidental ingestion. So that's what we're getting at here. And so when we're looking at these numbers, it's important to consider that we applied this to a dust sample. This is not necessarily exactly what somebody who would be eating an apple would be, experiencing, or a child that would be crawling around and like, eating something off the floor would be eating. But it gives us a sense for like, if the dust that people are consuming is exclusively the dust that we're collecting in these places, what the health risks might be. So take those caveats into account. But the way that we end up doing this when we're trying to assess for multiple metals at the same time is by calculating a hazard index. So a hazard index is the sum of hazard quotients for a bunch of different metals. So at a particular site, we calculate a hazard quotient by taking the average daily dosage and comparing that to a reference dose for a day. We get an average daily dose by taking the concentration of a particular metal and multiplying it by the ingestion rate per day, the exposure frequency, the exposure duration, and we relate that to body weight and to the averaging time. So that's a lot of ways of saying that it's basically like, how much are you ingesting, how often, how frequently, over what period, and what period are you averaging over for that. So when we look at what we're looking at here are a variety of different age ranges. So birth to 6 months, 6 months to 1 year, 1 year to 6 years, 6 years to 12 years, 12 to 20 years, and 20 to 80 years. And we're looking at the hazard index from dust consumption. We only looked at this at places that we would consider to be human exposure sites. So like if we collected on the top of a school or like next to a library or something like that. These are like the 7 sites that are like community exposure sites. These are not like out on Great Salt Lake Playa or right next to Great Salt Lake Playa. We didn't, that doesn't make sense from an exposure perspective. And then the 2 different colors are the percentile of dust consumption for each of the age groups. And so that's something that you can get from the EPA. And so, there's a very small number of very small children who are eating a lot of dust. Most of them are eating a lot less dust, which is fortunate. And then the distribution here comes from the fact that we have 7 sites in each of these, but also for each scenario, I did random draws off of each of the different features that go into it. So, how many days that they might be exposed, what's their body weight. So we've got a whole distribution in here. So you might have some of like your larger body sizes down here, or your like less frequent exposure down here where you have some of your smaller body sizes. more frequent exposure up here, something like that. So that's where we get this distribution from. There's like 70,000 points in each of these just because of the number of draws that I did. So the big picture takeaway here is pretty clear, is that our greatest risks are to our youngest age groups and our biggest consumers. You know, you can see that here for our birth to 6 months, 6 months to 1 year. These are the ones that are above that threshold of 1 for hazard index. And that's where you end up with a non-cancer potential hazard associated with that consumption. The other thing that might be useful to know is which different elements are making up the majority of, you know, each of these each of these hazard indices. So this is just from the median dust ingestion for birth to 6 months at all community exposure sites. But the relationships among the elements will be the same. The values might be different depending on what age group you look at. So our biggest contributor is thallium, but then we've got arsenic and lead, as well as cobalt, iron, zinc, manganese, copper, chromium, that are all making up, you know, some visible or sort of substantial portion of that hazard index. I just want to point out here, arsenic and then lead as well, we know come from, arsenic especially, and lead a little bit, come from Great Salt Lake Playa. And so coming out of this, I think it's reasonable to argue that there is a positive, there's likely to be a positive health outcome from any mitigation to dust emission off of Great Salt Lake Playa. Although we do have some other industrial sources and contributions here to consider. So the composition of dust varies across northern Utah. The central part of our study area exhibits higher priority pollutant fluxes, more elements associated with Great Salt Lake Playa dust. The southern part of our study area exhibits higher priority pollutants associated with industry, and small children are more vulnerable to non-cancer risks from consuming priority pollutants and dust than other age groups. And finally, dust mitigation on Great Salt Lake Playa may decrease exposure to some priority pollutants. Kind of what we got out of this. All right, now something different. We're going to talk about the isotopic evaluation of the National Water Model and what that reveals about human water use influences on streamflow across the Western US. And I did this work with colleagues Patrick Longley, Morgan McDonnell, Jim Reddy, Michelle Katoski, Olivia Miller, who was also here at the U, and then Renee Brooks. And this is published, so if you want to cite it, that's where you go. This study took place in the Western US. And the reason why we focused on this area is because the National Water Model performs the least well in the water-strapped West. So we're looking here at Kling-Gupta efficiencies. This is from a paper by Aaron Towler, put out in 2023. And the long and the short of it is purple colors are good, white colors are, the model is not doing so well. And so you can see, you know, in the West here, we've got a lot more of that white compared to like the East Coast or like the mountain ranges in these various places. So then the question is why? And so what we did was we applied stable water isotopes. And the reason that we went this direction is because, I guess I should say, things like Kling-Gupta efficiency and these other benchmarks are really great for helping us understand that there's a problem. There's a little bit more challenge in figuring out what the source of that problem is. Whereas stable water isotopes they're a tracer. So they're really good for like that fingerprinting. You can get much more closely at process depending on what the question is and what the process is you're going for. So that's why we chose that approach. So the kind of general project structure was that we took groundwater and runoff fluxes from the National Water Model, and we used a couple products that Gabe is responsible for. So estimated groundwater isotope ratios here from this paper, and then the waterisotope.org waterisotopes.org estimated precipitation isotope ratios. So the groundwater was applied to the groundwater flux and the precip was applied to the runoff fluxes. We did this sort of on average for the time period between 2000 and 2021, and only for summer months. And we compared that to observations of river isotope ratios from that period. And so these data come from the EPA National Rivers and Streams Assessment, from the USGS, and then from other literature data sets. And so you can see we had an awful lot of samples for comparison. In fact, 4,500 samples for comparison, 877 reaches. One thing that is important to note is on this side, we have this like long-term average value. On this side, we have anywhere from like 1 sample to a couple hundred samples at a particular site. So there is some variability that might be introduced by sort of the different time-scales. But with such a large data set, we were able to pull out something interesting. That's great. So kind of the first way we like to look at these things when we're water isotope people is just to take one of these biplots where we've got oxygen 18 on the x-axis and hydrogen 2 on the y-axis. And the gray here is model estimates, whereas blue are our observations. And the biggest thing to take away from this here is that our like modeled or our mass balance approach estimates are much more narrowly confined to something that looks a lot like the global meteoric waterline, whereas our observations are close to that too, but they have a bit more spread in this zone that tends to kind of represent evaporation or an evapoconcentrated signal in water. So then if we want to kind of understand how well the model is doing at predicting the observations, we can look over here. We've got a 1-to-1 line, so that would be a perfect relationship. And what we see is that the model does for oxygen 18, it does explain about 60% of the variance in the observations, which is good because it means that we're generally doing a good job spatially, but it also means that we have 40% of variance that's potentially very interesting and we can learn something from. That's great. So the next way we went about looking at this is we looked at the difference between the observation and the model in terms of oxygen and hydrogen. So that's what you're looking at here. And so this is an 8-to-1 line here, which is useful in water isotopes because it's there's a relationship between oxygen and hydrogen that has that ratio of about 8. If everything in the model were perfect, we would be basically clustered around this 0-0 point. Instead, what we see is, some distribution along this 8-to-1 line, but also, some scatter, some spread around this line. And this scatter is, I think, where, at least for this paper, where what we kind of delved into. So we used a parameter called ddiff that we created, which is basically like the divergence of any of these points from this line. And so in this case, on this side, we're in a negative ddiff space, and on the other side, we're in a positive ddiff space. And sort of in general, the negative ddiff space is more associated with evaporative processes, where the positive ddiff space is a little bit more associated with like snow processes. And you can kind of see that in the like evapotranspiration to precipitation ratio. Places where it's drier tend to be in this like negative ddiff space, whereas places where it's wetter tend to be on the other side there. So what does this look like spatially? Got a map for you. So kind of in general, I think it's a little bit hard to pick out the details here, but I think in general, it's nice to kind of see, okay, some of the places that are a little bit more like mountainous or wetter tend to be these bluer colors, which is the positive ddiff that we were looking at in the last figure. The redder spots, the redder locations tend to be lower elevation. Not totally exclusively that way, but you can kind of start to see that. It's a little bit better to look at it in in this space where we're looking like in basin by basin. So we're looking at the Upper Colorado, Lower Colorado, Great Basin, Pacific Northwest, and California. We're looking at catchment elevation in each of these. And then we're looking at our DDIF parameter. On the other side, we've got 0 here. So this is sort of all of our negative, like more evaporative, and then above, maybe more snowpack. And what we see here, oh, and then I should say, we've also got different Köppen climate classifications on here. So your diamonds are more arid, your circles are more seasonally snowy. We've got, is it a perennial stream or is it an intermittent stream? There's a lot going on here, guys. And then you've got stream order. So higher stream orders are like your bigger rivers. Smaller stream orders are your like smaller ones higher up in like the mountains or something like that. So the overall pattern here, and I think it's easiest to see for the Great Basin, basically like the lower you are in elevation and the more arid you are, the lower your DDIF value. You can see that well there. It's much harder to see in the Pacific Northwest, partially probably because the Pacific Northwest is much less arid. So then the question is, why? What might be going on here? And our hypothesis that we tested is that our lower elevation areas are maybe more likely to be affected by agriculture in some shallow groundwater return flows from agriculture. And so we first checked out the sort of groundwater isotope ratios by land use type. And we did see that deuterium excess, which is related to our DDIF parameter, tends to be the lowest when we're in places where the majority land cover is agriculture, even lower than like the desert or playas are also in the desert, that desert category. So that was our hypothesis, but we needed a way to test it. So the thing that we did for that is a little bit complicated, but I'll try my best to explain it. So we took water use data and land use data, both data sets that you can get from the USGS. We basically said, okay, this water use, wherever we're irrigating and wherever it's cropland, we're going to apply that irrigation. We're going to assume that all of the water that we applied in that place makes it to the stream. We're going to kind of add that in terms of proportion to what we've gotten from groundwater, what we've gotten from runoff. So we get a proportion of a reach at a certain place as you accumulate it down like a river system that is likely to be agriculturally influenced. This is like a very crude way of getting at this, but I think it did yield some useful results. So when you're looking at this, anything that's orange is more heavily influenced by agriculture by this metric that we calculated. Anything that's yellow is somewhat influenced, and anything that's green, we haven't calculated an influence of agriculture on that. I also marked off all the sites that have some influence of reservoir, calculated in a somewhat similar way. And we did some stats on this too, but the biggest thing that we saw statistically, and then from this, is that some of our lowest DDIFs come from places where we've got our highest agricultural influence. There's also a reservoir influence there, but it's hard to visually pick out with this. Since the data set is messy and the stats are significant, but not explaining like a ton of the variance, we also looked at some other methods for kind of getting at, whether or not National Water Model might be missing that component, and they did align with this finding that we have, but kind of a lot, so I'm not going to go into it for this study. You can read about it in the paper. So the big takeaways from this are that isotope mass balance estimates are strong predictors of observation, so that's good. And that we do see some spatial patterns in the differences, with more evapoconcentrated waters at low elevation in arid places and high stream orders. And that may suggest to us that we have a missing water source. And we were able to demonstrate that potentially irrigation return flows are contributing to these highly evapoconcentrated waters. So that's what I have for you guys today. We'll end there and appreciate your attention. Take your questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. I'm wondering, it seemed like from the Dove study, didn't have very many collectors that were up into the mountains.
Yeah.
Back and all.
Yeah.
And, maybe just a comment on what I was partly wondering about, and I'm not sure that your data speak to this, is whether or not your results were somewhat in agreement with Greg Carley's that the West Desert is still a more significant source of dust to the mountains, or not. Comment on that or not?
Yeah. So we're actually working up sort of a mass balance or like a mixing model approach that builds on Greg Carling's 2020 work, but trying to use even a secondary axis to that to try to get at, what proportionally is Great Salt Lake versus something else. I mean, when he was doing his study, lake levels weren't as low as they are now. So the systematics are a little bit different in that sort of downwind area than they were. But I think largely what we're seeing from the mixing model results is that our numbers are fairly close to being in agreement with like what he's done in the past. So it's still largely like looking like severe dry playa. But the tricky thing is that the local sediments, strontium-wise, also look like Great Salt Lake playa. So if you are collecting in town and just down the street they're doing construction, you're like, are your sediments coming all the way from severe dry lake? Are they coming from like, them building, what was that? There's like that second highway that they've been like constructing up in that zone. That's like,
10 years ago.
Yeah, maybe 10 years ago, or it's just like the sediments in this area, like the Bonneville shoreline sediments. We sampled a bunch of those and they look somewhere in between Severe Dry Lake and Great Salt Lake. So it's this like kind of complicated situation. But I do think that Greg's work he's done great work and also super strong in the sense of like within cities, the systematics are also a little bit different. You're being exposed to a lot more local dust, particles that aren't going to make it quite as far because they're bigger. Whereas like up into the mountains, you're going to need some of those smaller particles that might be coming from, our playas that have those like, smaller sizes and bigger wind events. Here, you might have a small, like a wind event like we had last night, and that might be enough to stir something up locally that you might, breathe in, but it might not make it all the way to, the mountains. So that's maybe a long way of getting at what you were saying, but yeah, definitely interesting to get into that mountain area. For this, we were really just focused on the people, what's going on for the people. Yeah. Right, like food chain stuff. That's definitely getting outside my realm of expertise there, but I know that there are a lot of folks, even here, like the mercury consumption and like duck sort of studies. So I would imagine that would be, potentially useful to be looking at like the brine shrimp and like the brine flies and like all of that. But I personally haven't seen work done on it, but I can imagine definitely be concerning. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. So I actually don't know for this version of National Water Model. So National Water Model is like wharf hydro driven by something. And so I know in the newer versions of wharf hydro, I think they are implementing like crop, like both water application and crop response. But I don't actually know for this version of National Water Model 2.1 what it's like. The NOMP land surface model is in there, but what version of that? And I don't think that they have crop in that data because it's sort of older. But I also, you maybe would know better being in the ET world. But yeah, so I would say that's something where it's like, I know it's NOMP, I know they've got ET, but I don't think they have crop stuff going on in that particular one. Yeah, I don't know if they have like water application like in at least in that version of NoMP. It Some of our other sort of check work on that suggests probably not. Like we compared what National Water Model, this version of National Water Model thinks is going on as far as groundwater flux in different areas in our study region. We compared that to a well level data set from Scott Jasheko from 2022, I believe, or maybe 2020. And so places where like more wells were below the river maybe should be losing, whereas places where more well levels were higher than river level, the river should be gaining. There's some geologic controls on that, but like when you compared to like places where National Water Model thought it was getting a lot of water versus places where it didn't think it was getting much at all, and you broke that out by the irrigation type in that upstream area, you could see some pretty interesting like nonlinear responses, but definitely effects of agriculture in the sense that like you would expect based on the Jasheko data set that it should either be higher or lower. Higher in places where you're taking groundwater from way deep and putting it on the surface, lower in places where you're taking groundwater from close to the surface and putting it on the surface. So yeah, there's that analysis also suggests to me that there's probably not the like taking the water from where it was and putting it somewhere new sort of information in that model. If that makes sense. Yeah, great question. They put gravel down, they put hay bales out, they wet down, you know, like if you're trying to control dust on like a tailings pile, they might like spray it down to kind of control that. So probably the most, Great Salt Lake Playa is huge, you know, and so probably the most economical thing is to find ways to do shallow flooding over areas of the playa, especially areas that we know are, you know, a bigger deal for dust emission. The thing that is complicated is it's not like the whole playa is emitting dust. It's like there are these different hotspots and they vary in space and time really rapidly. So it's not like you could just be like, okay, we know what problem is there. We're going to put water on that and like call it good. It's like, you know, the crust, there's like a salt crust, the crust will form, the crust will dissipate, the crust will get broken up, and then it'll form again. So it's a little bit of a moving target as to like where mitigation makes the most sense. And that's something that folks at the state are actively thinking about and working on. And Kevin Perry, who's in atmospheric sciences here, is working on, you know, projects to kind of test different dust mitigation techniques on the playa as well. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know so well about severe, but there's some kind of interesting signal in thallium on Great Salt Lake Playa, but the majority, what we've seen, the majority of our thallium we think is coming from like mine Bingham Canyon mine operations. So that's a copper mine. The copper in that mine is complexed with thallium and molybdenum. And so in our prior studies, we saw pretty strong relationships between thallium, molybdenum, and copper in our samples. And that held generally true in this data set as well. But there's this like kind of wild thallium spike in Ogden Bay. Let's see if I can go all the way back to it to just show you where it is. And I was talking to Scott Henick at our office. Many of you guys probably know him. But so here's the site where it tends to be a lot higher in thallium. And there's like a lot of maybe like groundwater system upwelling in this area. And he was thinking there's like a springs complex there too. And so he was thinking that there's some potentially pretty interesting like geologic stuff going on there. I had kind of a short conversation with him, but we haven't been able to delve into it too much more. But there's like some older papers that kind of, I don't know if they demonstrate that or they're more so about the just kind of general strontium and groundwater fluxes in that area, but sort of an interesting signal there. Otherwise, it's not like there's a broad distribution of thallium across like Farmington Bay or anything like that. That's, you know, the main driver there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't advocate for anything specifically, but
How bad are those numbers in other places?
Yeah. What's the context? My understanding, and to be completely fair, I'm pretty new to this world of like hazard assessment. So I'm learning as I go, but the EPA, the way that the EPA uses it is like you hit that benchmark of 1 and you start to like ask questions about what do we need to do health wise. So it's less about like, are we better or worse than our neighbor, and more just like, you know, we see this, you know, we might want to start thinking about what we need to do about it. Okay, popular subject. Yeah.
So the risk.
Yeah, average daily dose.
Big players are.
Yeah.
Across the age range.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I would say those are the biggest ones. I mean, I varied everything in here, but yeah, this like ingestion rate in this body weight is like, you could probably do away with most of the rest of this and just keep this and you would get pretty much the same, close to the same results. I mean, you can't do that much about how big a kid is, right? So like, from a practical perspective. Well, so we see explicitly the difference between ingestion rate here. So you can compare that directly. The two data sets are otherwise exactly identical that go into these two, but the ingestion rate is either the median or the 95th percentile. So if you're a median dust eater, sounds funny to say that, but if you're like a median dust eater, you're you know, below this value of 1. If you're a big dust muncher, then you're you know, maybe have a little bit more to worry about.
past time and getting into any local